The Port Charles Hospital corridors were abnormally silent that evening, as if they were holding their breath, waiting for something to destroy them. Britt Westbourne waited outside Rocco Falconeri's room, nervously pulling the hem of her white coat. She wasn't used to feeling this unstable and unsure of herself. As a doctor, she thrived on having complete control over what she said and did. But it wasn't about medication. This was deeply personal, and it was ripping her apart. Rocco, the young boy lying in the hospital bed, was a tough one. Everyone in Port Charles was aware of this. He'd been through more in his short life than most adults could bear, including losing his mother, Lulu, to a seemingly never-ending coma and navigating his father Dante's tumultuous job as a cop. Rocco, on the other hand, was always able to keep his head up, his dark eyes full of resilience that reminded Britt of his mother's. However, that spark was not present tonight. Tonight, Rocco was only a boy, little and defenseless, huddled up under the thin hospital blanket, his face pallid against the crisp white sheets. Britt had known Rocco since he was a child, when she and Dante had a brief, chaotic romance. She wasn't his mother, not even close, but she had always felt a peculiar bond with him. Perhaps it was because she recognized a part of herself in him, a child who had grown up too quickly, carrying burdens that no one his age should have to shoulder. Perhaps it was because she understood what it was like to feel alone in a crowded environment. Whatever it was, it made what she was about to do much more difficult. She'd been putting off this moment for days, ever since she overheard the chat in the hospital's break room. It wasn't intended for her ears, nothing in Port Charles was, but secrets had a way of sneaking through the cracks, especially in a place like General Hospital, where whispers were more powerful than shouts. The truth had emerged in shards, put together with whispered tones and mysterious glances. It was about Lulu, Rocco's mother, and no one dared to tell him. Not Dante, Laura, or Olivia, who was usually unable to keep her lips quiet. They all agreed that it was too much for him to bear. But Britt disagreed. She'd seen how harboring secrets affected individuals. She had lived it. She was not going to let Rocco grow up in the dark, no matter how painful it was. She gently knocked on the doorframe, her heart beating in her chest. Rocco looked up from the bed, his eyes red-rimmed yet dry, as if he'd cried all of his tears. "Hey, kid," Britt responded, faking a smile that resembled a grimace. "Can I come inside?" Rocco nodded, but his expression was wary, as if he knew something horrible was about to happen. Britt believed he was too smart for his own good as she set up a chair next to his bed. The room smelled of antiseptic and a faint floral perfume from Laura's bouquet earlier that day. The flowers were already wilting, their petals drooping as if they realized they didn't belong in this environment. "How are you holding up?" Britt inquired, her tone quieter than usual. She wasn't excellent at soothing people and breaking terrible news. She was more adept at repairing shattered bones than broken emotions. Rocco shrugged, his little shoulders scarcely making a mark on the large medical robe. "I'm fine," he responded, but his voice broke at the last word, betraying him. He wasn't well. He hadn't felt well since the accident that brought him here, a hit-and-run that left him with a fractured leg and a heart full of questions no one seemed willing to answer. Britt took a deep breath and tightened her fingers on the chair's arms. She had practiced this moment 100 times in her thoughts, but now that it was here, the words felt heavy, like stones in her mouth. "Rocco," she began, but stopped as her throat tightened. She stared at him, truly looked at him, and saw terror in his eyes, as if he was bracing himself for what she was about to say. It crushed her heart. "There's something I need to tell you," she finally whispered, barely above a whisper. "It's about your mom." Rocco's expression transformed in an instant, from wary to rawer, more desperate. "Is she all right?" he inquired, sitting up straighter despite the discomfort it must have caused his leg. "Did she wake up?" Britt's chest ached. She wanted to lie and tell him that Lulu was fine and that she would be walking through that door any minute with her bright smile and intense love for her son. But that was not the case, and Britt had told herself she would not do that to him. Not anymore. No, Rocco, she answered, her voice firm, despite the fact that it took all of her strength to keep it that way. She did not wake up. And she's not going to. The words hung in the air, weighty and definitive. Rocco stared at her, his eyes wide and incomprehensible. For a moment, it was as if he hadn't heard her, as if the words hadn't hit home. But suddenly his face crumbled, and he let out a primal, guttural sob that seemed to come from the deepest part of him, unlike anything Britt had ever heard. He curled in on himself, his small body shivering fiercely, and Britt felt her own eyes well up with tears she hadn't realized she was suppressing. She reached out, hesitating for a split second before resting her palm on his shoulder. He didn't back away, but he didn't lean toward her either. He was lost in his misery, drowning in it, and all Britt could do was sit there, her hand a mere anchor amid the tempest of his anguish. "I'm sorry, Rocco," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." The secret wasn't simply that Lulu had left. That was how it happened. Britt discovered the truth during a chat between two nurses, their voices low as they discussed the newest hospital gossip. Lulu's coma was not completely accidental. There had been issues, including a drug error that no one had detected in time. Lulu's death was the result of a terrible error, not malevolent intent. The hospital was keeping it quiet in order to avoid a lawsuit, but Britt wouldn't allow it happen. Not when it meant keeping Rocco in the dark about the mother he had lost. She didn't tell him the specifics just yet. He was too young, too frail, to bear the full weight of it. But she told him enough. His mother would not return, she had battled as hard as she could, and she loved him more than anything else. The words felt insufficient, like attempting to repair a massive gash with a band-aid, but they were all she had. Rocco's weeping soon subsided, but the silence that followed was terrible. It was the kind of silence that devoured everything, leaving just emptiness behind. Britt wondered whether she had made a mistake as he stared at the wall with lifeless eyes. Perhaps she should have told Dante, Laura, or someone who was more skilled at this than she was. But then Rocco spoke, and his voice was so faint she almost missed it. "Why hadn't anyone told me?" he inquired, and the betrayal in his tone wounded deeper than any knife. Britt gulped hard, her throat tightening. "They thought they were protecting you," she replied. "They didn't want you to get hurt." "But it hurts anyway," he murmured, his voice shaking again. "It hurts worse because they lied." Britt nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. She did not bother to wipe them away. "I know," she replied. "That's why I needed to tell you. You, Rocco, deserve the truth. Even if it hurts." He didn't say anything else, simply leaned toward her, putting his head on her shoulder. It was the first time he had done that, and it caught Britt off guard. She threw her arms around him, embracing him as tightly as she dared, and for a time, they were just two people grieving together, joined by a truth that was both painful and important. The days that followed were blurred. Dante was enraged when he discovered Britt had told Rocco the truth, his voice ringing throughout the hospital as he wanted to know why she hadn't consulted with him first. Laura was subdued, her grief a great burden that appeared to age her overnight. Olivia wailed, her typical confidence dissolving in the face of Rocco's anguish. But Britt held her ground. She had done what she believed was right, even if it made her the villain in their eyes. Rocco did not say much after that night. He went through the motions, physical therapy for his leg, meals he barely tasted, and family visits that left him looking at the ceiling. But every now and then, he'd look at Britt and notice something in his eyes that wasn't there before. Not quite forgiveness, but a type of understanding. As if he knew she was the only one brave, or foolish, enough to tell him the truth. Britt wasn't sure if she had done the right thing. She had never been good at following her intuition, especially in issues of the heart. But as she watched Rocco gradually recover physically and mentally, she couldn't help but hope. I hoped he would find a way to carry his pain without letting it define him. I hoped he'd grow up knowing his mother loved him deeply, even if she couldn't be around to demonstrate it. And hope that, in some little way, she had helped him by telling him the truth, no matter how painful it was. Port Charles would continue on, as it always had. There would be new scandals, secrets, and tragedies to fill the corridors of General Hospital. But for Britt, this moment would be with her forever, the moment she gazed into a boy's eyes and told him the truth that broke his heart, possibly helping him begin to heal. Nancy Lee Grahn never anticipated that after 3 decades of pouring her heart and soul into a character beloved by millions, her voice would be the one to pull the rug out from under her. For years, she had been vocal, unafraid to speak her mind, question authority, and stir the pot. It was part of what made her human, and it kept her passionately alive. But in the delicate realm of daytime television, where reputations were created or ruined on whispers and timing, one incorrect phrase might bring everything crashing down. The day the news broke started softly. She awoke early, poured her customary dark roast coffee, and allowed the vapor to flow lazily through the morning air of her Los Angeles kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, except from the gentle ticking of the wall clock. She looked at her phone, scrolling through mentions, half-smiles, and worried brows as supporters, critics, and strangers discussed her most recent tweet on Charlie Kirk. Nancy had intended it as a rebellious statement, a rebuttal to a voice she deemed destructive. But she could already sense the storm coming. She had endured hurricanes before. She was used to receiving a barrage of replies any time she took a stand, her timeline filling with both adulation and hate. But this time, it felt heavier and darker. The retweets piled up, news blogs took notice, and within hours, the conversation had shifted from Alexis Davis, her character on General Hospital, to Nancy Lee Grahn herself. By lunchtime, a pit had formed in her stomach. She could feel the shift in tone between the texts, from debate to condemnation. Some begged ABC to silence her, while others urged action. She attempted to dismiss it, telling herself it was only noise, that it would pass, and that the internet would find another target the next day. She'd told herself this before, and it was generally correct. But she couldn't ignore the call that came through on her phone in the early afternoon, a private number that made her stop breathing. Frank Valentini, the voice said flatly and cautiously. Nancy's fingers tightened around the phone. She realized right once that this was not a nice check-in. She recognized the tone of producers when they were practicing diplomacy. "We need to talk," Frank remarked. The silence extended. She almost wanted to laugh, to tell him to bypass the formalities and go straight to the end. But her throat was too dry, and all she could say was a faint, "Okay." Later that day, she sat in her living room, watching the California sun sneak through the blinds. She didn't recall how she got there after the call ended, or if she had said anything at all. Only fragments, difficult position, network pressure, statements causing division. The words blurred together, the phrases losing meaning until only one lingered like smoke in the air. "The network has decided to let you go." Her heart plummeted. 30 years. 30 years of waking up before dawn, memorizing texts till her eyes burned, and becoming Alexis so completely that she often lost where Alexis ended and Nancy started. 30 years of tears, conflicts, and courtroom addresses are etched into soap opera history. All of it was wiped with one sentence. She attempted to stand, but her legs trembled underneath her. She grabbed the arm of the couch and let herself slide back down. It wasn't simply a profession, it was her entire identity. Without General Hospital, who was she? The hours following the call felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Friends texted her, some hesitantly questioning if the stories were true, while others offered support without any confirmation. Fans flooded her mentions, some angry at the network, others quietly weeping. But Nancy felt distant from everything, as if the words were floating about her in another universe, one she could no longer access. When nightfall arrived, she poured herself a glass of wine and looked out the window at the fading light. She recalled the first time she came onto the set in the mid-1990s, her nerves jangling as she entered a place that would become her second home. She remembered the makeup chair, the laughter among castmates, the fragrance of the soundstage, and the clatter of heels on linoleum floors while cameras rolled. She remembered Maurice, Finola, Jeannie, and all the legends she had witnessed. They had shared not only scenes, but years of their lives. She worried how she would face them now, and how she would say goodbye. Nancy wasn't naive. She was aware that her remarks had ramifications. She was aware that her disobedience was part of what drew some people to her and part of what turned others off. However, she had always believed in her right to stand up and call out what she saw as wrong. But, in that moment, she recognized that independence came at a high cost she hadn't anticipated. The next few days blurred together. The network's statements were carefully phrased, as if they were intended to absolve as well as condemn. The trade seized up the story, with headlines shouting her name next to phrases like fired, controversy, and backlash. Paparazzi gathered outside her home. Calls from journalists flooded in, hungry for sound bites, fury, and tears. But Nancy wouldn't give them what they wanted. She remained silent, her grief too acute and her pride too frail. She had a nighttime dream about Alexis. She dreamed of the role she'd played for so long, the one who battled for justice, overcame abuse, and was flawed, damaged, and strong all at once. In her dreams, Alexis inquired, "Why are you leaving me?" Nancy would wake up with tears on her pillow. Her daughter called her every morning, her voice calm, telling her that she was more than this part, that she had value outside of the set, that she was still her mother, herself. Nancy listened, but within she felt empty. She didn't know who she was without the regularity of lines, lights, and cameras. Weeks passed, yet the show continued without her. New tales emerged, and Alexis wrote them with barely a whisper. It pained more than she cared to admit, watching the fans lament her absence and how quickly the world moved on. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life, alive but invisible where she had mattered the most. One afternoon, she drove by the studio. She didn't mean to, but her car appeared to know the way. She parked across the street and looked at the familiar building, where she had spent her best years. Her hands squeezed the steering wheel till their knuckles turned white. She wanted to walk inside, feel the air, and say goodbye properly. However, she knew she couldn't. That chapter was closed and sealed without her consent. The sadness weighed more than she expected. She remembered all the actresses who had come before her, legends who had been let go, replaced, and wiped from the shows they had helped create. She had always promised herself she would depart on her own terms, with dignity and gratitude. But now the decision had been taken away, along with her peace of mind. At night, she scrolled through fan tributes, which included footage of her best scenes and montages of Alexis' victories and heartbreaks. The fans remembered what the network preferred to forget. They remembered the soul she had given, the genuineness, and the fire. Their love moved her to tears, but it also intensified the pain of what she had lost. The industry has moved on. Casting news flooded the trades, new series premiered, and new disputes erupted. But Nancy remained in the shadows of her own loss, torn between rage and sorrow. She often pondered about Frank Valentini and whether he had any regrets. Did he think about her at all, or had he already buried her in the never-ending cycle of daytime drama, another casualty of the industry? In quiet moments, Nancy told herself that maybe this wasn't the end, that she still had stories to tell, roles to play, and audiences to reach. But the pain lingered to her, the weight of rejection after a lifetime of dedication. She was left with recollections and the realization that she had said the truth and paid the price. It wasn't the ending she desired, but it was the one she was given. And, as the world of Port Charles whirled on without her, Nancy Lee Grahn sat in the solitude of her home, her heart hurting with the realization that Alexis Davis, the woman she had brought to life for 3 decades, now belonged only to the past. Nancy Lee Grahn had always believed that her voice counted. In her perspective, it was part of her responsibility as a public person to not only play a character but also to speak out and use her platform in ways that went beyond the studio. She had a reputation for being strong-willed, never afraid to speak the truth as she saw it, even if it was unpopular. Her followers frequently praised her for it, but her detractors waited for every blunder like wolves circling prey. She knew her comments about Charlie Kirk would spark a conversation. What she didn't realize, and couldn't have predicted, was that those remarks would be the fracture that led to the end of a 30-year career. It began slowly, as all scandals do, with a few answers filtering in under her post. Some clapped immediately, while others cheered her on. Nancy, drinking her morning coffee, dismissed it as just another day in the digital era, another round of debate that would fade into tomorrow's cacophony. But by midday, her phone was constantly vibrating, with thousands of notifications piling up and the conversation spiraling out of control. Her remarks were screenshotted, analyzed, distorted, and replayed until she could scarcely recognize the meaning behind them. Strangers penned articles about her, followers disagreed vehemently in comment threads, and conservatives online advocated for boycotts. She'd felt storms before, but this one was different. It seemed like she was standing on a rock watching the earth below crumble. By early afternoon, she could feel the shift. The tone of the discussion hardened. Journalists began tagging ABC, asking if the network endorsed her words. Hashtags promoted accountability. Nancy felt her gut tighten as she refreshed her feed repeatedly, stuck in a cycle of disbelief. She assured herself she was strong and that she could handle this like she had others. But when her phone called and the private number flashed, she knew immediately that this storm was not one she could simply wait out. Frank Valentini, the voice said, steady yet tinged with anxiety. Her chest constricted. "Frank. We need to talk," he began, his voice as solid as stone. The talk went like a script she never wanted to read. She sat rigidly on the couch, her gaze fixed on the muted television, where soap reruns flickered. Frank's tone was deliberate and controlled, and his vocabulary was carefully measured, phrases like difficult position, network concerns, and public fallout. He didn't speak harshly, but he also didn't speak warmly. He was only the messenger of an unavoidable conclusion. "The network has decided to let you go." The words pierced her chest. 30 years passed in silence. She attempted to respond, argue, and explain, but her throat tightened. She could barely recall what she replied back, if she said anything at all. All she knew was that when the call was over, she sat staring at the phone in her lap, her reflection twisted on the darkened screen. She stood up and soon felt her knees weaken. She slid back into the couch, gripping the armrest. She was not only losing her job. She was losing a lifetime of identification, a home, and a family that was not blood-related but seemed just as important. Alexis Davis had long been a part of her, woven into her own heartbeat. Without Alexis, who was she? The nighttime hours dragged like sludge. She poured herself a glass of wine and swirled the scarlet liquid against the crystal. She recalled her first day at Port Charles, the butterflies in her stomach, the excitement of meeting the crew, and the sheer amazement of being a part of something that had shaped American daytime for decades. She recalls falling into Alexis' skin and how soon the character became an extension of herself, rather than merely a role. The courtroom passages in which she delivered angry monologues, the raw vulnerability of Alexis's alcoholism, and the soft motherly moments. These scenes had made an impression not just on admirers, but also on Nancy herself. Her phone buzzed again, this time with messages from friends and castmates. Some were cautious, asking, "Are you okay? Would you like to talk?" Others arrived angry, saying, "This isn't fair. They can't do this to you." Fans flooded her replies with heartbreak, pleading with ABC to reconsider and remembering about decades of Alexis storylines. But Nancy was unable to reply to any of it. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard before falling away. Her anguish was too acute to express. The next morning, she awoke to headlines splattered throughout every soap blog, followed by mainstream publications. Nancy Lee Grahn was sacked from General Hospital following comments concerning Charlie Kirk. She hadn't even had a chance to grieve quietly before the world became aware of her suffering. Her name was trending alongside terms like controversy and fallout. She turned off her phone and sat in silence. The walls of her house seemed to close in, and each framed portrait of her career became sharper and heavier. There were photos of her with other cast members at award events, smiling in gowns under the bright lights. Photos of behind-the-scenes experiences, frank laughter, and memories from years when she felt like she belonged. Each one now served as a reminder of what had been taken. Days blended together, time defined only by the length of shadows across her living room. She did not go out. Paparazzi had been seen around her driveway. Reporters called, emails inundated her inbox, and interview requests poured in. She disregarded them all. She had no words. What could she possibly say that wouldn't trigger another storm? However, sleep did not provide any alleviation at night. She had constant dreams about Alexis. In her dreams, Alexis was furious with her, questioning why she had abandoned her and walked away. Nancy tried to explain that it wasn't her choice, but the dream always ended the same way. Alexis turned away, leaving Nancy in the dark. Her daughter's voice was the only connection to reality. Every morning, she called gently and steadily. "You're still you," she would reply. "You're more than that role." Nancy wanted to believe it. She wanted to remember that she was still a mother and a strong lady. But within, she felt hollow, as if Alexis had been her anchor, and now she was adrift. Weeks later, she found herself driving aimlessly, the city streets familiar yet distant. She turned a corner and realized, with a start, that she was approaching the studio. Her grip on the wheel tightened, and before she could stop herself, she pulled over across the street. The edifice loomed there, untouched and bustling with activity. Her chest ached as she could almost hear the clatter of crew, the buzz of voices, and the command for action. She wanted to walk inside, take one final breath, and say goodbye properly. But she remained in the car, tears silently falling down her face. That universe was no longer her own. The sadness deepened with each passing day. She often pondered about the actors who had been let go after years of service and had vanished from storylines without proper farewells. She had always assumed she'd depart on her own terms, with dignity, and possibly with Alexis receiving a plot befitting of her past. Instead, she was erased by a phone call and a press release. When she navigated over social media, she discovered followers creating tribute films. Her screen was loaded with clips of Alexis' most memorable episodes, including her confrontation with Helena Cassadine, her honest confession of her alcoholism, and her quest for justice in court. Nancy cried every time she watched the films, which were captioned with phrases like "thank you" and "legend." The fans remembered what the network had chosen to forget. But the agony lasted. She constantly wondered if Frank Valentini thought of her or if the decision affected him in any way. Or was she just another victim of an industry that consumed its own when convenience called? She had dedicated her heart, years, and everything to this show. And in the end, it wasn't enough. Months passed, and the world moved on while she stayed in grief. New narratives filled Port Charles, and new scandals dominated the media. Nancy watched from afar, her name vanishing from the news. She attempted to convince herself that stillness was ideal since it allowed her to heal. But the anguish never went away. Some nights she mumbled to herself in the dark, attempting to persuade herself that this was not the end. Perhaps there were still roles for her, stories to tell, and audiences eager to see her. But her voice would falter and shatter under the strain of doubt. The truth was that she felt abandoned, silenced, and a ghost in an industry she had helped shape. Her greatest heartbreak was not leaving her job, celebrity, or even the daily routine of set life. It was losing Alexis. For 30 years, the figure had served as her friend, mirror, and shadow. Being separated from Alexis was like losing a piece of her soul. There was no replacing that. Nancy Lee Grahn sat alone many evenings, a wine glass in hand, gazing at faded images and faint memories. She remembered Maurice and Jeannie's laughing, Finola's whispered support, and the innumerable crew members who had become family. She remembered the followers who had grown up watching her and had written messages about how Alexis had given them courage. She reflected on everything she'd given and how fast it was taken away. It was not the ending she desired. It was not the end she deserved. But this was the ending she had been handed. And, as the world of General Hospital spun on without her, Nancy remained in the silence of her home, grieving the loss of a life she had built, mourning a character who would always be a part of her, and living with the hollow truth that sometimes speaking your truth comes at a cost too high to bear.